Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. You know, for me, this is canning season. Canning really has no season, but if it did, this would be it. And yesterday I lucked out and got some beef at a really good price. And you know, here in August 2020, that's unusual. And I recently got a new canning book, the all-new Ball Book of Canning and Preserving. And I am loving this book. It has lots of new one-jar meals and vegetables that are quick and easy raw packs. So I thought I would show you how I do the Ball's recipe for pot roast in a jar. So first let me take care of a little business. This is not an official Ball video. It is a Ball recipe. I'm just going to show you how I do it. I don't get anything from Ball, but I would be very happy if you would give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Now let's start canning. So I'm making a double recipe. I'll put the ingredients for a single recipe in the info section. I have here an eye of round. The recipe calls for chuck roast. I'm simply not going to pay $1 a pound more when I got this on sale. 2 cups of peeled diced potatoes, 1 cup of diced celery, 2 cups of peeled sliced carrots, 2 cups of diced onions, 4 teaspoons of salt, 2 teaspoons of freshly ground black pepper, 4 teaspoons of dried thyme. The recipe calls for 4 cloves of sliced garlic. I'm using minced garlic. That will be 4 teaspoons full. The recipe calls for beef broth as needed. I don't know how much will be needed, so I have 2 quarts here. And it also calls for 2 cups of dry red wine, which is optional and I'm not going to use it, and it calls for bay leaves. For this double recipe, it would call for 4. I'm actually going to use 2 because canning intensifies spices, and I just am not that crazy about bay leaves. Dry spices are always interchangeable in a tested recipe, so you're free to exercise a little discretion. So here I have weighed out 4 pounds of this beef, close enough to 4 pounds. And this particular cut of beef, an eye of round, is a lot leaner than the chuck the recipe calls for. But I am going to cut this little layer of fat off. Fat can be a problem in canning in that it can climb up the sides of the jar and interfere with your seal. It's just the nature of meat that you can never get every single bit of the fat off of it. But when canning, you always want to try to get as much of the fat off as possible. And this particular cut of beef, the eye of round, has very little fat. So now I'm going to cut this beef up. And remember, this recipe is for pot roast in a jar. It's not for beef stew. And while the ingredients would be absolutely the same, the cut's a little different. And it specifies 2-inch chunks of beef, which is going to be really hard because this is not 2 inches thick. So I just did it as close as I could. I'm doing this in pints, so I'll hold that in mind when I'm cutting. I will cut it different next time, and I'll show you that when I start filling the jars. So I'm going to show you a little trick here. This recipe calls for the vegetable measurements to be in cups and milliliters. Milliliters indicates a liquid measurement. Now, I'm going to chop up these potatoes. They're peeled. I got rid of all the eyes. You always want to do that with potatoes. I want 2 cups of chunks. I have a 4-cup measuring cup here with 2 cups or 500 milliliters of water in it. And I'm going to chop up these potatoes, and it doesn't specify a size in the recipe, by the way. And I'm going to put them in this cup. Because, you know, it's kind of hard to measure little chunks in a liquid measuring cup or in any measuring cup. So I put in 2 cups, and if I fill it up until it indicates 4 cups, then I've got 2 cups of potatoes, or 500 milliliters. And when I cut potatoes, I always want to put them in liquid anyway to keep them from discoloring. If they were going to sit very long, I would put a little lemon juice or citric acid in the water so that they don't discolor. I want them to be nice and white when I put them in the recipe. So just go over how you will see measurements in recipes. If it says milliliters, that indicates a liquid measurement. If it says grams, that's a weight. If it says ounces, that's either a weight or a dry measurement. If it says fluid ounces, that's a wet measurement. We get this question a lot in our canning group, Safe Canning by the Book on Debbie's Back Porch on Facebook. So I just thought I'd take a minute to clarify that. So I do that until the measurement's at 500 milliliters, and that's enough chopping for one video. You know how to chop. The next step is getting the canner ready. We have 3 quarts of 140 degree water, which is what you need for a raw pack recipe. And I'm heating 2 quarts of the beef broth. And now we're going to assemble everything. By the way, I have my jars sitting in 140 degree water over here, and they're also full of water. You can hold them in the canner instead of a separate container. For me, this just makes less mess. I have washed my lids and I have them ready to go. No, you don't have to heat them first. Just wash them in at room temperature. That's my chopsticks I use as a debubbler. That's my jar lifter. Now we're going to mix everything together. Now, if you'll look at this beef, I'm afraid I was not very uniform in my cutting. A lesson learned. Next time, instead of trying to get 2-inch cubes and realizing that I can't, and a lot of these are more like 1-inch cubes, I'm going to portion the meat out in 8 equal portions. The way I cut them and the way this recipe is written makes it difficult to make sure that your jars have equal amounts and equal portions of meat and vegetables. That won't impact the safety of this recipe, but some jars have less beef than others. So I'm adding the salt. I'm going to mix this all around. This will be very quick. I'm just putting all the ingredients together. The salt, the spices, and there's the pepper. And I'll add, let's see, what am I going to add next? There's the carrots. And you see I sliced those per the recipe. And the onions. They are cubed, minced. You can do them. There is no direction for the size of these. It just says diced. And I'm leaving them, now that's sort of large, because if I were doing pot roast, I would put big chunks in. I mean pot roast, just cooking a pot roast. I did call ball to make sure on these 1 jar meals and vegetables, the size of the chunk of the vegetables is not a safety issue. So there's my minced garlic. Let me tell you a little bit about minced garlic. The arthritis in my hands makes it very difficult for me to deal with the little pieces of garlic. So I buy the minced garlic, and it's preserved in vinegar, and 1 clove equals 1 teaspoon if you're measuring that. Let me mention the wine that is optional. I almost never cook with wine. And no, that doesn't make me a barbarian. But I don't add wine for 2 reasons. One is because, no, the alcohol never all cooks out. That's a myth. It never all cooks out. And especially when you're canning, where do you think it's going to cook out to? Oh, by the way, I'm dealing with the bay leaves right now. You have to crunch them up to get a little bit in each jar because, you know, I'm going to have 8 jars. I only have 2 bay leaves. 4, the recipe calls for 4. You're going to have to chunk them up. Back to the wine. The second reason I don't cook with wine is because it's just sugar. It just brings so much sugar. and I try to avoid added hidden sugar. In canning recipes like this, wine is almost always optional if you are in doubt. If the wine in your recipe is optional, you can call Ball and ask them. I've already called on the French onion soup, and the wine is optional. So now I'm filling the jars, and I will show you one from the beginning, but I wanted to take just a minute to be very specific about what finger tight means. Now, when you're putting your rings on, if you'll see, I've put the lid on that one and made sure it was seated properly. And I wiped the inside of my rings out with just a little bit of vinegar to make sure there are no little stray spots of rust. And then I twist the lid on until it moves, till the jar moves, and then with just my fingers, I turn it just a little bit more until I meet resistance. That's finger tight. We're doing one jar at a time. This one's going in the canner. Now I'll show you a jar from the beginning. Okay, now we do one jar at a time. I take one jar out of the hot water. Make sure I got all the water out of it. You'll see I have a little bowl with about 2 ounces of vinegar in it. Here's my jar. You need to work quickly, one at a time, because you don't want that jar to cool off before it goes into the hot water. So my little funnel here measures my 1-inch headspace. And you can see what I mean about the size of the beef. Next time I will try to cut my beef into 8-ounce portions and season it separately from the vegetables. That would just make it easier to make sure you have uniform amounts in each jar. As I say, that's not a safety issue. It's just the final product would be better for you if you had measured the beef separately. So this is raw pack, which means you're just going to have to push the vegetables down in there. We want to get as much air out of the jar as possible, because with raw pack, vegetables float. So my little funnel here measures a 1-inch headspace, and I'm going to fill it with the hot broth up to the 1-inch mark. And that may change because you want to debubble. You want to get the broth down all the way down so that you don't have any air pockets. That's really important. Always debubble. When you do that, things move around. I don't want the vegetables over the 1-inch mark, so I took one out. And when I got the air out, it lowered my water level, my broth level. So I'm going to add a little bit more. So we're at 1 inch. I'm going to debubble again. You know, there is a handy little tool that's plastic. I've broken, I can't tell you how many. So I use chopsticks. You can use anything, plastic or wood, just don't use any metal for this. Then I dip a paper towel in the vinegar and I clean very well around the rim of the jar, inside and out. And that's to make sure you don't have any little tiny chunks of food or spices to interfere with the ring. We worry about the lid and we tend to forget about the ring. But the ring is what holds the lid in place, so you want it to be perfect. And if any of your rings have gotten out of shape, throw them away. So I'll show you finger tight again. Put the ring on. I always turn it backwards just a little bit to make sure it's properly seated. And then you turn it until the jar moves. And then with just your fingers, you turn it a little bit more, 1/4 to 1/2 inch, no more than a 1/4 turn. This is ready. It goes in the canner. I'll meet you at the stove. So I have 8 pints. This is a double recipe going into my 140-degree water. By the way, if you decide to make a single recipe, you should never process less than 2 quarts or 4 pints at a time. This is my All-American 915. Sorry for the fuzzy shot there. My camera's trying to autofocus. With the All-American, you just lift the bolts up into place and then you tighten them on opposite sides. And with my temperature at 140 degrees, the canner's not yet so hot that it's dangerous to touch. It won't burn me. If I were doing a hot pack recipe and the water were at 180 degrees, I would be doing this with pot holders. But it's just not that hot yet. 140 degrees is the temperature of your tap water. So I'm tightening my bolts and whatever canner you're using. Whenever you get the lid seated properly on the canner, turn your heat up. And I don't turn my heat up until the canner is sealed. And I turn my heat to medium-high. Depending on your stove, you may have to turn it all the way to high. And now we just wait for the canner to vent. Let me explain venting. I know you can't see it on the camera, but there is a plume of steam coming out of that vent hole. And we want it to vent like that for a full 10 minutes to drive out any excess air in the canner. After the 10-minute vent, we can put the weighted gauge on the stem. You're going to want to do this with a pot holder because it's really hot. Different canners operate differently. If you don't do a full vent, your gauge will not read properly, and you might end up canning at too low a temperature. I have turned my heat down to the sweet spot, and when we reach the proper pressure, the weighted gauge will start to rattle, or rock, or turn, depending on your type of canner. The All-American has both a dial gauge and a weighted gauge. My elevation is under 1,000 feet, so that is 11 pounds. If your elevation is over 1,000 feet, that'll be 15 pounds on a weighted gauge canner. I'm setting my timer for 75 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes for this recipe. So let me explain what I meant by the sweet spot. When your canner has finished venting, you want to turn your temperature down to what would be the lowest possible temperature to maintain the proper pressure. I know what that is with my stove and my canner. It's at about 3.5 on the dial for my burner. You can figure out what yours is by doing a can of jars of water. You want to maintain the lowest possible heat so that you don't lose water during the process through the vent hole. I've left the sound on for this so that you can see and hear that my weighted gauge doesn't actually rattle through this whole process. It should give a good rattle between 1 and 4 times a minute to maintain the proper pressure. And you can see when it rattles, you can see the steam coming out. That will indicate a loss of water because that weighted gauge is letting off excess pressure. And when it does that, it also lets off some steam. And that won't matter so much with shorter processing times, but when you're getting up to 75 and 90 minutes, it could matter. So I urge you to learn the sweet spot on your stove. So for the next 5 seconds, I'm just going to let you listen and watch. And I'll be back when the timer goes off. So it's been 75 minutes. My timer has gone off. I've turned off the heat. I'm going to wait for this gauge to go all the way down to 0 before I take the next step. Your canner may be different. It may have a locking mechanism that lets go when the pressure's been released. But with the All-American, I have this dial so I can see when we're at 0 pressure. Now with my canner, when the dial reaches 0, there may be a little residual pressure left. So I remove the weighted gauge very slowly. You don't want a sudden change in your pressure inside the canner. That's what causes siphoning. So I'm going to take this off after very carefully allowing any residual pressure to escape. Once I've done that, I'll set my timer for 10 minutes and just let the canner cool for 10 minutes. I'll be back. After that 10 minutes, we can take the lid off. And with the All-American, you just twist these little valves. These little bolts. And if you'll notice, I am now using an oven mitt or a pot holder. Everything is pretty tight. Yeah, they're coming loose now. And we'll take the lid off, just according to how your canner opens, and we'll lift it up away from us so that any steam vents out away from you, because that will hurt. Now I'm going to set my timer and wait another 10 minutes. Don't skip this step. The jars are too hot to come out into the room temperature air. After that 10 minutes, you can take your jars out. You don't want to set them directly onto a hard surface. I mean, these are really hot. They're still boiling inside. You can either spread out a towel, a dry towel, on your counter, or I put them on a silicone cutting board right here on the stove so I don't have so much dripping. Couple little side notes here. Some of the rings may be very, very loose. Don't be tempted to tighten them down. If you were canning with Tatler lids, you would tighten them down at this point. But with the regular metal lids, don't touch them. And another small thing that sometimes folks ask about, when you're canning meat and you tried to get all the fat out, but you will never get all the fat out, sometimes there is a reaction between the vinegar and the fat that vents out, and your rings can look dark. Don't worry about it. It'll wash off. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong. So now they're going to sit here for 12 to 24 hours before I touch them again. At that time, I will take the rings off and check the seals to make sure that each jar is sealed. Then I'll wash the jars in warm soapy water and store them away with a label and without the rings. The rings have done their job. They held the lid in place until it's sealed. You don't need them anymore. You know, this looks like it's going to be really yummy. When I get ready to serve this, I will make a roux with 1 tablespoon butter, 1 tablespoon flour, and pour the liquid in to make a gravy, and then pour the meat and vegetables in to make a lovely pot roast. I'm pretty happy with this recipe. I hope you like it. I hope you try it. And I hope to see you again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.